Hey, honey. You'll never guess who's running for PTA president this year, my wife, Julia, announced as she breezed into the kitchen, her smile beaming with excitement. I looked up from my newspaper, barely registering her words. Let me guess, I muttered, stifling a yawn. It's you. Oh, please, she rolled her eyes. I barely have time to sleep, let alone run the PTA. No, it's our very own Mrs. Henderson, the math teacher. But she asked me to join the planning committee for the spring fundraiser. Ah, the PTA. Julia had only joined it last year after our daughter, Sophie, entered first grade. She was always looking for ways to be involved in Sophie's school life, and the PTA seemed like the perfect opportunity. At first, it had been a harmless time commitment, a few meetings here and there, bake sales, and some classroom volunteering. But recently, it had become more. There were long evenings at school events, weekend meetings, and endless phone calls with PTA friends. I brushed it off as Julia's overzealous nature. She could never do anything halfway. Another committee, huh? Doesn't it ever slow down with them? I chuckled. Not really, she laughed, her eyes glinting. But it's fun. And besides, it's a good way to make friends. That part was true. Julia was a natural people person. But it wasn't just friendships she was making. Lately, I'd noticed some strange changes in her behavior. Little things at first. She'd started dressing up more than usual for meetings, taking extra time with her hair and makeup. At first, I joked that the PTA must have some new dress code I didn't know about. She brushed off my comments with a smile, but my gut told me there was something more. I need to trust her, I told myself. We've been together for 10 years. She's the mother of my child. Still, the thought nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. The real change happened a few weeks after that PTA conversation. One evening, I was looking for a pen in the kitchen drawer and stumbled across Julia's phone. Normally, I'd never think of touching her phone, but it buzzed right as I picked it up, a message lighting up the screen. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. My stomach dropped. I knew I shouldn't jump to conclusions. It could have been harmless, but as I scanned through her messages, my fears began to solidify. This wasn't a friend or even a colleague, it was a name I didn't recognize, Ben. I felt the room spin as I stared at the message. Ben, who was Ben? My mind raced through all sorts of scenarios. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was just a new PTA friend, someone she hadn't mentioned yet. But deep down, something about that message felt wrong. Something was happening, something she hadn't shared with me. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't look at Julia the same way, and I found myself watching her every move, noting every smile and every text she sent. She seemed oblivious to my suspicions, laughing and chatting as usual, but I knew something was different. Then, one evening, she came home late. Really late. Oh, sorry, she said, clearly startled when she saw me still awake. We had to work out some last-minute details for the fundraiser. At 11 p.m. I replied, unable to keep the suspicion out of my voice. She flinched, her face momentarily falling before she caught herself and forced a laugh. You know how these things go, she said, brushing past me and heading up the stairs to our room. I didn't follow her. I stayed in the living room, staring at the spot she had just stood, my mind racing. It felt like I was caught in some twisted dream, one where my worst fears were coming true. Was my wife really hiding something from me? Or was I simply letting paranoia get the best of me? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that message flashing in my mind. I knew what I had to do. I needed to get answers, and if Julia wouldn't give them to me, I'd find them myself. Chapter 2, The Search for Answers. The next morning, Julia seemed cheerful as usual, humming in the kitchen as she packed Sophie's lunch. I watched her from the doorway, trying to read her expression, wondering if she had any idea about the storm brewing in my mind. I couldn't confront her outright, I didn't even know what I'd say. But I also couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion eating away at me. So, I decided to dig deeper, see if I could find anything more concrete before jumping to conclusions. Maybe it would all turn out to be a misunderstanding. When she and Sophie left for school, I waited until the house was silent. Then, I began my search. First, I checked her phone. I knew her passcode, but as I looked through her recent calls and texts, there was nothing out of the ordinary. No more messages from Ben, just a few PTA reminders and group chats with other moms. I scrolled further back, looking for any clue, but everything seemed normal. Maybe I'm imagining things, I thought. But the unease wouldn't go away. Next, I logged onto our shared computer in the living room. Julia and I didn't usually keep secrets from each other, and I knew her email password, so I typed it in and held my breath as her inbox loaded. At first glance, it was just as uneventful as her phone emails from the school, notices about events, the usual promotions and newsletters. But then I noticed an email in her drafts folder with no subject line, addressed to an unfamiliar email, ben.jacobson123@gmail.com. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The draft was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been meant for someone significant. Had she written and deleted something? The name sounded almost too ordinary, like it could belong to anyone. But why was there a blank draft addressed to him? As the days went by, I found myself increasingly distracted. Every time she left for a PTA meeting, every time her phone chimed, my mind would jump to the worst conclusions. I'd glance at her as she chatted animatedly on the phone or hurried out the door, searching her face for signs of guilt. But Julia was either innocent or had become very good at keeping her secrets. One day, during my lunch break, I decided to drive by the school to see if I could catch a glimpse of her at one of her so-called meetings. Maybe it would ease my mind, reassure me that everything was as she said. I parked a few blocks away and walked toward the school, feeling ridiculous but determined. If Julia was really just involved in PTA work, I'd find her there with the other moms. But as I approached the building, I didn't see her in the crowd of familiar faces. I scanned the group, hoping to spot her blonde hair or her unmistakable laugh, but she was nowhere in sight. Disappointed and more suspicious than ever, I turned to leave, and that's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the parking lot, near a black SUV, talking to a tall man I didn't recognize. They stood close together, her hand resting on his arm as she laughed at something he'd said. He smiled down at her, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. I couldn't see his features clearly, but I could make out enough: dark hair, broad shoulders, an air of confidence that made my stomach twist. I stayed hidden, watching as they talked for what felt like an eternity. I could tell from their body language that this wasn't some casual PTA friend. There was a closeness, an intimacy between them that I hadn't seen in years. Finally, they hugged a long, lingering hug before he got into the SUV and drove off. She watched him leave, then turned and walked back toward the school, a dreamy smile on her face. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My worst fears had been confirmed. Julia, my wife, the woman I had trusted for over a decade, was seeing someone else. The drive home was a blur. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my hands were shaking, my mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and betrayal. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. How had things come to this? How had the woman I loved turned into a stranger right before my eyes? That night, I could barely look at her as she prepared dinner and asked me about my day. I mumbled responses, barely hearing her words. She was distracted too, her gaze occasionally drifting to her phone, her expression unreadable. It was like we were playing a twisted game, both of us keeping secrets, neither of us willing to break the silence. I knew I couldn't let this go on much longer. But I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. I needed to know more who he was, how long it had been going on, why she had kept it from me. And so, I made a decision, I was going to follow her. Chapter 3, The Follow. The decision to follow Julia was not one I made lightly. Every fiber of my being screamed against it, but my need for answers overpowered my sense of guilt. I had to know the truth, even if it shattered everything I thought I knew about my wife. The following morning, I kept my distance as she got ready for another PTA meeting. She was more upbeat than usual, humming a tune as she applied her makeup and fixed her hair. I watched her through the crack of the bedroom door, heart pounding. She was in her usual routine, no different from any other day, except now I was seeing it with new eyes, eyes that questioned everything. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing at me over her shoulder. She was dressed in a blazer that seemed too formal for a simple PTA meeting. Her makeup was more polished than I was used to, her hairstyle just so. "Yeah, just tired," I mumbled, trying to hide my nervousness. "You'll be okay with Sophie tonight?" "Of course," she said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "I'll be back after the meeting. Don't wait up." As soon as she left, I waited a few minutes before following her. I took a quick shower to try to shake off the sense of impending doom, trying to remind myself that I was just doing this to understand what was going on. I left the house and got into my car, careful not to alert her that I was tailing her. I waited for her to drive down the street, and then I followed at a distance, trying to stay hidden behind a few cars. My palms were sweaty as I gripped the wheel, every part of me screaming to turn back. But I couldn't. She drove toward the school, but then, instead of pulling into the parking lot, she took a sharp turn onto a side street. My heart skipped a beat. This was not normal. She had never taken this route before when heading to school. I kept my distance, trying to stay far enough behind so she wouldn't spot me, but close enough to follow her movements. My mind was running wild. Was she meeting him again? Was this how it was all happening? Was this affair going on for weeks, or months? She pulled up in front of a small cafe, not a typical place for a PTA meeting, at least not one I had ever heard of. I parked down the street, out of view, and waited, my hands still shaking. I couldn't believe I was doing this. But I couldn't stop myself. About 10 minutes passed, and I saw Julia walk into the cafe, her head down as if she were trying not to be seen. I couldn't see the man yet, but I knew that he was inside waiting for her. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching the cafe entrance. Finally, the door opened. Julia stepped outside, followed closely by the man from the parking lot. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his tall frame unmistakable. He smiled at Julia, his hand brushing against hers as they stood there for a moment. They said something too far away for me to hear before he kissed her lightly on the cheek. That was the moment I had been dreading. Seeing them together, seeing the chemistry, the closeness, made my stomach churn with a mixture of fury and despair. It hit me all at once. She wasn't just having a fling, she was in love with him. I watched them part ways as Julia got into her car and drove off. The man stood by the door for a few moments, watching her leave, before he walked back inside the cafe. I stayed there for another few minutes, trying to compose myself. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and heartbreak. I had been blind. The signs had been there all along, and I had chosen not to see them. Julia had been lying to me for months, living this double life while I had been none the wiser. As I made my way back home, my mind raced. What was I going to do now? I couldn't just confront her right away. I needed a plan. I needed to be sure of everything before I spoke up, because once I did, there was no going back. That night, as Julia returned home, I acted as if nothing had changed. I could see the small, satisfied smile on her face as she walked through the door, but I kept my own expression neutral. "How was the meeting?" I asked casually, my heart hammering in my chest. She glanced at me, a little surprised by my calmness. "It went well," she said. "We finalized everything for the fundraiser. It's going to be great." I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. "I'm glad," I said, forcing a smile. But the truth was, I wasn't glad. I was devastated. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend everything was okay. I had seen the truth with my own eyes, but I didn't know how to face it yet. The real question was, what would I do next? I couldn't let this go on any longer, but I had to be smart. I had to make sure I had everything before I confronted her. I couldn't just throw my suspicions in her face without knowing the full picture. But one thing was for sure, I was no longer the man who trusted his wife without question. The woman I had married, the mother of my child, was living a double life, and I was determined to uncover every secret she had been keeping from me. Chapter 4, The Confrontation. I couldn't sleep. It was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Julia and the man in the cafe flickered in my mind. Their smiles. The way they'd stood so close to each other, their bodies naturally leaning in as if they didn't even realize how intimate the moment was. That kiss on the cheek, it was something a husband didn't get, not anymore. The distance between us felt like a canyon now. The next few days were a blur. Julia continued with her usual routine, not a hint of guilt on her face. She was so caught up in her world, her PTA meetings, and her secret life, that it was as if she was oblivious to the fact that her husband had caught on. But every time she left for another meeting, I felt the sting. I was counting the minutes until I could confront her, but when? How? I couldn't keep living this way. My entire existence had been built on trust, on the assumption that we were a team. But now that trust had shattered. It wasn't just about her betrayal, it was about the fact that she'd been lying to my face. She had been living a double life, and I had no idea how long it had been going on. The night I decided to confront her, I couldn't contain the anger and hurt anymore. I had gathered enough evidence. There were the secretive texts, the email drafts, the late nights, the strange meetings, and now the man. I couldn't keep letting her pull the wool over my eyes. I waited for her to come home, sitting in the living room in the dark. The house was silent, save for the hum of the fridge. My hands were clammy, my mind racing. This wasn't going to be easy. But it had to happen. When the door opened, Julia stepped in, surprised to see the lights still on. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice light, as if nothing were wrong. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice low but steady. She paused, sensing the shift in tone. Her smile faltered, and she slowly walked toward me, a small frown creasing her brow. "About what?" she asked, her voice almost too calm. I stood up, my heart pounding. I couldn't let her hide behind any more excuses. "About you," I said, my voice tightening. "About everything." Her eyes darted nervously, but she said nothing. I took a step closer, needing to look her in the eye. "I know about him. Ben. The man you've been meeting." Her face paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She clearly hadn't expected this, but she also knew, deep down, it was only a matter of time before I found out. "You've been lying to me, Julia," I continued, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "For how long? How long has this been going on?" She backed away slightly, her hand instinctively reaching for the counter as if to steady herself. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain?" I scoffed, feeling a bitter laugh rise in my throat. What's left to explain? I saw you with him, Julia. I saw you kiss him. Don't lie to me. Her face crumpled then, a wave of emotion hitting her like a tidal wave. She blinked rapidly, her lips trembling. I never meant for this to happen, she said softly, her voice barely audible. It started so innocently. Ben's, he's been helping with the PTA stuff. He's been a good friend. I stared at her, unable to hold back my disbelief. A good friend? Really? That's your excuse? I laughed bitterly. How do you explain everything else, Julia? The late nights, the texts, the secret emails. My chest was tight, as if my heart had been lodged in my throat. You're having an affair with him, aren't you? She broke down in front of me then, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop it. At first, it was just friendship. But then it became more. And I hated myself for it. I thought about telling you, but I couldn't. I didn't know how. I was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a stone. It felt like everything I'd known about our marriage, everything I'd believed in, was unraveling before me. This wasn't just a mistake, it was something deliberate, something she had allowed to grow until it had become an affair. Do you love him? I asked, my voice a low whisper. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I needed to know. She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. Yes, she said quietly, the admission falling from her lips like a death sentence. I do. I never wanted it to happen, but I do. I stumbled back, as though the weight of her words had physically knocked the wind out of me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The woman I had loved, the mother of my child, was in love with someone else. And she had kept it from me for so long. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, numb, unable to speak. My mind was racing, my emotions swirling in a whirlwind of disbelief, betrayal, and pain. Everything we had built our life together, our family had been a lie. I felt as though I were drowning in it. Finally, I managed to speak, my voice hoarse with emotion. I don't know how we move forward from this, Julia. I don't know if I can forgive you. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands clutching her face, her sobs racking her body. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. But the damage was done. The trust was shattered. And though I could see the remorse in her eyes, the hurt and regret, it didn't change the fact that she had betrayed me. She had chosen him over us, and there was no easy way to fix it. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I had no idea what would come next. Would we try to salvage our marriage? Would I even be able to look at her the same way? Or was this the end? For the first time in years, I felt utterly lost. Chapter 5, The Fallout. The days following our confrontation were filled with tension and silence. Julia remained at home, but it felt like we were strangers living under the same roof. Our interactions were minimal, our conversations shallow and stilted, as if we both feared what would happen if we said too much. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of the betrayal, the way she had lied to my face for months, no, for years, hiding a part of herself from me that I would never have imagined. We hadn't discussed it in detail since that night. It was as though the air between us was thick with unsaid words, neither of us knowing how to proceed. I would catch her staring at me sometimes, her eyes filled with regret, but also with something else I couldn't quite place. Guilt. Sadness. I couldn't tell. What I did know was that the image of her with Ben haunted me at every moment. I couldn't escape it. Sophie, thankfully, had no idea what was going on. She was still so young, and we had both worked hard to shield her from the tension. But the cracks in our marriage were starting to show. Sophie would sometimes ask why Daddy wasn't playing with her as much or why Mommy seemed so sad. I would offer half-hearted excuses, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was breaking. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. I had always prided myself on being the strong one, the one who held things together, who kept the family running smoothly. But now I was adrift. I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. Julia walked into the room, her eyes red from crying. She had been more distant than usual these past few days, probably because she didn't know how to face me either. She stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitant, as if waiting for some sign from me. "I know you're angry," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But please, please let me explain more. Let me try to fix this." I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, staring into my glass, feeling the weight of the moment crush me. It wasn't just about her betrayal anymore, it was about everything we had been through together. The years, the memories, the love that had once been so pure and certain. How had it come to this? I took a slow sip of my whiskey, still not meeting her eyes. "I don't know if it can be fixed, Julia. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her face crumpled, and she walked toward me, kneeling in front of me, her hands reaching out to take mine. "I've been so stupid. I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. I don't know why I did it. Ben, he's different. He was there when I felt like I was drowning in everything. The PTA, Sophie, the house. I just needed someone to see me, to make me feel like I still mattered. But that's not an excuse. I'm so sorry, Jake. I never meant for this to go so far." Her words hit me like a freight train. I felt the sting of everything she had said, but a part of me, some small part deep inside, still wanted to believe her. Still wanted to believe in the woman I had married. But was that enough? Could a few heartfelt apologies undo everything? "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to myself. The silence stretched between us again, but this time, it wasn't the cold, suffocating silence we had been living in for days. This silence was full of pain, full of a depth of emotion neither of us was sure how to navigate. "I'll do anything to make it right, Jake," she said, her voice shaking. "Anything. I'll end things with Ben. I'll leave the PTA, I'll give you space. I just need you to know that I am so sorry for everything." I pulled my hands away from hers, standing up abruptly. "You don't get it, Julia," I said, pacing the room. "It's not just about you ending things with him. You've already crossed a line. You've already shattered what we had, and now you expect me to just pretend everything's okay? You don't get to just erase what you've done. You don't get to fix this just by saying the right words." She stood up slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered, her voice broken. "I know I can't take it back. I can't change what happened. But I can show you, over time, that I'm trying. That I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. I want us to find a way back to each other. I love you, Jake." The words hung in the air like a fragile thread. Could love really fix this? Could the woman who had betrayed me with such reckless abandon truly be the same woman who had once promised me forever? I didn't know. And I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to find out. The next few days were the hardest of my life. Julia tried her best to show me that she was committed to making things right, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the image of her with Ben. The guilt she felt didn't change the fact that she had chosen him over me, over our family. I didn't know if I could ever let that go. I started seeing a therapist. At first, It was just for me, to figure out what I needed to do with all these emotions. But as the weeks passed, Julia began to go too, hoping it would help us navigate the pain of rebuilding, of deciding whether our marriage could survive this. There were moments of hope, moments when I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with. But the shadows of betrayal were always there, hovering just out of reach. Could we survive this? Could we heal? Or had the damage already been done? I didn't have the answers, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted them. Chapter 6, The Decision. It had been a month since the confrontation, and each day felt like an uphill battle. Julia and I continued with our fragile attempts at reconciliation, but the road was anything but smooth. The distance between us was palpable. She was doing everything she could to prove that she was sorry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been lost, that we had been lost somewhere along the way. Sophie had noticed the change too. She was more withdrawn than usual, her bright eyes dimmed by the tension that lingered in the air. I caught her glancing between Julia and me, as though trying to make sense of the new reality in which we found ourselves. She would ask questions sometimes about Mommy and Daddy not talking much, or why Daddy seemed so quiet. It broke my heart every time. I tried to keep up appearances for Sophie's sake, to make things feel as normal as possible. But normal didn't exist for us anymore. I had spent the past few weeks buried in therapy, trying to process the overwhelming mix of emotions I felt. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and even guilt. I had moments where I thought maybe we could fix things. Julia's attempts at rebuilding trust, her sincerity in wanting to make things right, it wasn't lost on me. But then I'd have moments where the pain of her betrayal would come crashing back, and I wondered how I could ever look at her the same way again. Julia was still adamant that she wanted us to work, that she was committed to fixing her mistakes, but a part of me, a deep part, didn't know if I could forgive her. And that part was getting louder every day. One evening, after another awkward dinner where we both sat in silence, I decided it was time to confront the truth. Not just about her affair, but about where we were and where we wanted to go from here. "Sophie's in bed," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Julia looked at me with cautious eyes, as if bracing for something she feared was coming. "We need to talk." She nodded, setting her fork down, wiping her mouth with a napkin. There was a long pause before she spoke. "I know," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been waiting for you to say that." I studied her. There were no tears this time, no desperate pleas. She had cried her way through the first few weeks of our separation, begging for forgiveness, but now, there was an air of resignation around her. It was as if she had accepted that there was only so much she could do. That I had to make my own choice. "What do you want, Julia?" I asked. "What do we want?" She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward the window as though looking for the words. "I want to fix this. I want to rebuild our marriage. I want to show you, over time, that I can be the woman you thought I was. I love you, Jake. I know I've broken your heart, but I can't imagine my life without you and Sophie." Her words were still filled with sincerity, but it didn't change the fact that the foundation of everything we had built had been cracked beyond repair. I could see the pain in her eyes, the desperate hope, but something inside me was pulling in the opposite direction. "I know you love me," I said, my voice thick. "But love isn't always enough, Julia. Love isn't what tore us apart. It's what you did to me. It's the trust you broke. I don't know if I can ever feel the same way about you again. I don't know if I want to feel the same way." The words hurt me just as much as they hurt her. But they were the truth, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was being honest with myself. I had been trying to salvage something that wasn't going to come back, no matter how hard we tried. Julia's face fell. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but then stopped. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if preparing for something inevitable. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying that I don't know if we can keep doing this," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm saying that I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every time I look at you, I see him. I see what you've done. And I can't keep living in that shadow. I don't think I can forgive you. I don't think I can get past this." The silence in the room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on us. Julia's shoulders slumped, and she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Are you leaving me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, my heart aching with every word I was about to say. "I don't know. I don't know what comes next. But I think we need some space. Time apart. To figure out what we really want. Because right now, I'm not sure we want the same things anymore." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes once again. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't want to lose you, Jake. But if this is what you need, I'll respect it." I stood up then, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the only choice left. I had to start healing. And part of that healing was recognizing that the person I had once trusted with everything might no longer be the person I needed. "I need to figure things out," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "And so do you." She nodded again, her hands trembling in her lap. "I'll give you the space you need," she said softly. And just like that, the decision was made. We didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. I didn't know if we could fix this or if we even should. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for what she had done. But I did know that I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Not anymore. That night, I slept on the couch. It was the first time in weeks that I felt the smallest semblance of peace, even though my heart was still broken. I didn't know if our marriage could be saved, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let go. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was finally ready to face it even if it meant facing it alone. Chapter 7, The Space Between Us. The days stretched on, dragging with the heaviness of uncertainty. Julia and I had agreed to give each other space, but it was harder than either of us had anticipated. We shared the house, but it was as if we were living parallel lives, two people in the same place, but miles apart in our hearts and minds. We didn't talk much, only when we had to. She would ask about Sophie's schoolwork or about the bills, but the small talk felt hollow. We were like strangers in our own home, and each time I saw her, it was a reminder of everything that had broken between us. The silence between us was deafening, and yet neither of us seemed to know how to bridge the gap. I kept busy, spending hours at work, burying myself in tasks I could focus on. It was a distraction from the pain, a way to avoid confronting the impossible questions, what do I do now? What do we do now? Julia spent more time in her office, working late into the night on the PTA events, but I could feel her eyes on me whenever I walked by, as if she was hoping I would look at her differently. But I didn't. I couldn't. There were moments when I thought about what we used to be, the way she used to smile at me, the way we'd stay up late talking about our hopes for the future. But those memories were tangled with new ones, the ones that made me question everything. I had never imagined that a betrayal so deep would ever be something I'd have to face. The first week of our space felt like walking through a fog. The air was thick with unspoken words. But by the second week, I began to feel the weight of the isolation. I didn't just miss the version of Julia I had known before. I missed the connection we had once had, the way we would laugh at the silliest things, how we would share everything, from our smallest victories to our darkest fears. The trust, though, was gone, and it was that loss that I could not get past. One night, after Sophie had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the living room, the house silent around me. I was staring at the empty space across from me where Julia would normally be. For a moment, I considered going to her, asking her to talk, but the fear of what would happen if I allowed myself to be vulnerable again held me back. She had hurt me, and now, I wasn't sure I could afford to open up to her again. I picked up my phone and dialed a number that had become a lifeline to me during these difficult weeks. It was an old friend, Mark. We hadn't talked much since we had both settled into family life, but Mark was someone I trusted. He had always been there when I needed advice, and I needed someone to help me make sense of everything that was going on. "Hey, man," Mark answered after a few rings, his voice warm and familiar. "How's everything going?" I paused, feeling a lump in my throat. "Not great," I admitted. It's complicated." "You want to talk about it?" Mark asked, sensing the weight in my voice. I took a deep breath and began to tell him everything: how Julia had betrayed me, how I had found out about her affair, how we had tried to work through it but now, everything felt like it was falling apart. Mark listened quietly, offering no judgment, just the occasional sound of understanding or sympathy. "It sounds like you're caught between a rock and a hard place," he said finally. "You love her, but you're hurt. And no matter how much she apologizes, you can't erase what's been done." I nodded, even though I knew he couldn't see me. "Exactly. I don't know what to do. I feel like if I stay, I'm only going to keep hurting. But if I leave, I'm breaking up my family. Sophie will never forgive me." Mark was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "You have to do what's right for you, Jake. For your sanity, for your heart. And you have to be honest with yourself about whether staying in this relationship is going to heal you or keep you stuck in pain. It's a tough decision, man. But it's your decision." His words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. "It's your decision." I sat there, contemplating his advice, realizing how true it was. I had been so focused on what was best for Julia, for Sophie, that I hadn't really thought about what was best for me. In all this pain, I had neglected my own needs, my own healing. I needed to make a decision not just about Julia, but about me. I had spent so much time wondering if I could forgive her, if we could ever get back to where we were, that I had forgotten to ask myself the most important question of all: what do I need? The next morning, I decided to take a walk. I needed air, a chance to clear my head. I put on my shoes and left the house, walking aimlessly through the neighborhood. The fresh air felt good against my skin, but I could still feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. I walked for miles, trying to find some clarity, but all I could think about was how much I had changed in the past few months. How much Julia had changed me. I found myself standing in the park, watching children play, their laughter a stark contrast to the storm swirling inside me. I looked down at my phone and saw a text from Julia, *, "We need to talk tonight. I can't keep pretending like we're okay *. I stood there for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't know if I was ready to talk. I didn't know if I was ready to hear what she had to say. But I knew one thing: I had to face her and face myself sooner or later. There was no running away from the truth anymore. The question wasn't whether or not I could forgive her. The question was whether we could rebuild our life together, or whether it was time for us to go our separate ways. That night, I sat down with Julia, and for the first time in weeks, we talked openly. "What happens now?" I asked her, my voice trembling with the weight of everything we had been through. Julia looked at me, her eyes tired but filled with the same sorrow they had held when we first spoke. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I want to try. I need to try, Jake. I'm sorry for everything. And I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust, if you'll let me." I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if I could forgive her or if I was willing to try again. But in that moment, I realized something important: I wasn't ready to give up on us just yet. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. But it wasn't going to be easy. And it wasn't going to happen overnight. It would take time. It would take effort. But for the first time in a long time, I felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe we could find a way back to each other. Chapter 8, Rebuilding from Ashes. In the weeks that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Julia and I had agreed to give this attempt at rebuilding a real chance. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. But we were both committed to trying. We started small. Every evening after Sophie went to bed, we would sit down together. Sometimes we would talk about the past, about what had gone wrong. Other times we would talk about more mundane things, our favorite TV shows, how our day went, something that didn't carry the weight of everything else. Slowly, we began to carve out space for each other again, but the trust, that unspoken bond we'd once shared, was still fractured. Julia started therapy too, as I had. She went regularly, and I could see her grappling with the pain of what she had done. But there was no magic fix for what had been broken between us. It was slow, painful work. We began attending couples counseling together, our sessions a mixture of uncomfortable silences and raw, gut-wrenching honesty. Our therapist helped us navigate the pain, the hurt, the layers of betrayal that had built up over the years. But every time we left those sessions, I felt both a sense of relief and a deep unease. What if I couldn't forgive her? What if this was all too much? Sophie, in her usual bright way, picked up on the subtle changes. She could feel the shift in the house, the tension that lingered in the air. She would ask if we were okay, and we would tell her that everything was fine, even though neither of us felt fine. She would see us sitting together sometimes, lost in conversation, and she would smile, happy that her parents were talking again. But I could see in her eyes that she knew something wasn't quite right. Kids always do. One weekend, Julia and I took a trip to a small lake cabin we'd rented for a couple of days. It was a way to escape the pressure of home, a space where we could reconnect without the distractions of work, therapy, or the ghost of Ben. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew it was a step forward. The cabin was simple, rustic, tucked away in the woods with a beautiful view of the lake. We didn't talk much during the drive there, the silence between us comfortable but still heavy. When we arrived, we unpacked in silence, the only sound the creaking of the cabin and the distant call of birds outside. That night, we sat on the porch, the moon reflecting off the water, casting a soft glow over everything. It felt peaceful. I had forgotten what peace felt like. Julia broke the silence first. Jake. I know this has been hard. I know I've hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm trying. I want you to see that I'm doing the work to change. I nodded, looking at the water, the ripples distorting the reflection of the moon. I see that, I said softly. I know you're trying. But it's not just about seeing it, Julia. It's about feeling it. It's about the trust. I don't know if I can get that back. She nodded, understanding. I don't blame you. I know it's going to take time. I need you to know that I'm here. I'm here for you, for us. I could hear the sincerity in her voice, but the truth was, I didn't know if I was ready to open up again. The betrayal still stung. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her. But every time I let my guard down, the memory of her with Ben would rush back, and I'd pull away again. For the rest of the weekend, we didn't push too hard. We went on walks, had quiet dinners by the lake, and just tried to be together again, even if it was awkward. There were moments, small moments, where I felt a flicker of hope, where I saw glimpses of the woman I had married. But there were also moments of doubt, of confusion. I didn't know if this was enough. I didn't know if we could ever get back to where we were. When we returned home, things didn't magically improve. But the trip had given me a little more clarity. Julia was right, she was trying. And I was trying too, in my own way. But that didn't mean I had forgiven her. And that didn't mean I was ready to fully trust her again. We were still in the process of rebuilding, each day a step forward, but with setbacks along the way. There were good days, where we laughed together and felt connected again. But there were also days where the silence between us was suffocating, where I would find myself lost in thought, wondering if I could live with the scars of her betrayal for the rest of my life. One evening, after a particularly rough therapy session, Julia sat down beside me on the couch, her hands shaking. "Jake, I'm scared," she confessed. "I'm scared that we're never going to get through this. That you're never going to be able to forgive me." I didn't know what to say. How could I reassure her when I didn't even know what the future held for us? "I don't know, Julia," I said, my voice heavy with the truth. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. But I'm trying. I'm trying because I want to believe in us. I want to believe in what we had." She leaned in closer, her face full of desperation. "I will do anything, Jake. Anything to show you I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I can work every day to prove that I'm committed to our future. Please, don't give up on me." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. The woman I had married was still there underneath the mistakes, the guilt, the pain. She was still the person I had once loved so deeply. But was that enough? I didn't know. But maybe, just maybe, it could be. Chapter 9, Moving Forward. A month later, we made the decision to move forward, slowly. We weren't all the way healed, not even close. But we were learning how to take small steps. Julia had begun to rebuild my trust, piece by piece, with her actions, not just her words. She was consistent, patient, and open in ways she hadn't been before. But it still hurt. The scar was still there, a constant reminder of what had happened. We spent time together, rebuilding not just our relationship, but our family. Sophie was happy again, seeing her parents connect in ways that felt more genuine. We laughed more, and we argued less. But there were days when the weight of the past would crash down on me, and I would retreat inside myself. But I had come to realize something important: healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars, accepting that they were a part of me, part of our story now. I still didn't know what the future held for Julia and me, but I knew that we were trying. And maybe, for now, that was enough.